I'm glad I found paper scissors to eat. Well, hello, Shiny Crafty People. It's Tim Totten here, and welcome back to the channel. I'm just cutting out a pattern that's for a batwing mask. I'm not making any more masks, but I am going to talk to you today about 10 sewing terms that I think every sewer should know and also reconsider. And because I started this channel making masks, I thought I would use one of the patterns to show you a few details. So let's dive right into it. You know, I first started this channel making mask videos, of course, back during the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of people came on at that point saying, I haven't sewn in a long time. And now they're picking up and following along with me, making interesting new projects. And so I thought, you know, there's some terms that unless you've been sewing for a long time, you may not have heard of or at least understood exactly what they mean. So I want to share with those people who might be new to sewing important terms that you need to know. But I also want to make sure that if you've been sewing for a long time, like me, more than 35 years or so, that you also get a little brush up, because maybe there's some things you didn't know exactly. And I actually did some investigation for many of these terms to find out what they really deeply mean so that we can all be on the same page. So let's get started. The very first term I want to bring to you is, I'll show you on the bottom of the screen, salvage. Now, this is not, like I thought it was for at least 20 years, salvage. And I'll put that word at the bottom of the screen, salvage. It's not salvage. Salvage, S-A-L-V-A-G-E, I think is the right way. Well, I've looked it up after the video to put it down here. It is like when there's been a shipwreck and they send out a crew to go try to pick anything up off the bottom of the ocean. They're salvaging from the wreckage. Or sadly, when somebody's house burns down and they go and try to go through what's left and see if they can salvage any of their personal memories. Or a salvage yard, you know, with old cars and stuff. That's not what this is. Salvage actually has to do with the edge of fabric. So think about it. I'm going to be talking mostly in fabric terms about fabric on big bolts like this. This is quilting fabric, mostly cottons. And so this is made on a gigantic loom. They weave this fabric, so it's cotton that's woven. There are long, long threads that run the full length of however much they're weaving at a time. So those long threads get run, and then they run threads back and forth. And if I can find some video that I'm allowed to share of the way a weaving process works, you'll see how things and then they shove thread back and forth. Well, those threads turn around as they keep going, and they go across the width of the fabric, which typically in this type, even though it's on a bolt right now and it doesn't look as big, there's a double layer of fabric on here. And so it's typically about 44 inches across. There's 44 inches of width of fabric on here. You see it folds there in the middle. And the salvage is this edge right here. This edge that runs along it. And you see it's kind of, on this one, it's a little bit shaggy. That is a little bit of shagginess. But it's not always. Sometimes it's bound up. Either way, this is the edge of the fabric that is usually different than the fabric in between. It's usually, a lot of times it's like doubled or triple over where those threads are rolling and turning back and forth. And because this is a printed fabric, meaning they wove a light color fabric and then printed on top of it, you'll notice that on the inside it's a slightly lighter color because this is just seeing through the back. But they use the edge, the salvage, to print important things. So this has a copyright. Let me turn it around, it'll be a little easier to read. This has the copyright of the company that makes it, and it has some details. It has some numbers here so they can match the different fabric colors. So that is salvage, is that particular edge. So if you find a pattern that tells you to line something up toward the salvage or shows you where the salvage would be, well, that's what they're talking about. The next thing I want to talk to you is about bias. Because remember, I told you those threads are all woven together and there's threads running one direction and threads running another direction. And if you cut your fabric along these threads, then when you pulled, you wouldn't get any stretch to it, which is perfectly fine. But if you went off on the bias, which is a 45-degree angle, you would be able to stretch that fabric out. In fact, I just showed that on a half square triangle video. I'll cut some video what that looks like so you'll see how that stretch happens that's been cut on the diagonal. You can get quite a lot of stretch on a piece of fabric that way. That is cutting on the bias. So if you ever heard of a bias cut dress, that means they've been cut, the fabric's been cut on the bias so that it'll move and have some nice stretch to it, especially when it's just like a satin bias cut dress. Satin's actually a pretty hard fabric unless you cut it on the bias, and then those different threads will stretch. Now, speaking still about fabric, I want to talk specifically about the size and shapes of fabric that are available, specifically about fat quarters. So if you've been sewing for any period of time and making quilts or other craft items, you may have heard of fat quarters and even used them or bought them at the store. If you wondered how they figured out the shape and the size of that piece of fabric, well, here's how they do it. So a quilt store or a fabric shop or a fabric company will roll out fabric in 1 yard increments. If you said, I want to buy a yard of fabric, they would roll out this bolt of fabric. They would measure to 36 inches, which is 1 yard, and cut it. And then of course that would leave you with a piece that was 36 inches wide, doubled over, so that when you opened it up, it would be 36 inches times the 44-inch width of the entire fabric on the bolt. Well, if they were going to do 1/4 of a yard, they wouldn't give you a full 36 inches. And 1/4 of a linear yard is 9 inches. But that means they would cut a 9-inch strip that's now 44 inches long. And there aren't a lot of projects that need a 9-inch strip of fabric that are 44 inches long. Instead, if you're wanting to make something like one of the DOP kits that I've done, and I'll show you a picture of that, and then there'll be a link to the description below for a great project to make a DOP kit. Well, you would need actually 1/4 of a yard of fabric, but cut a different way. So instead what they would do is open up that 36-inch by 42-inch piece and then cut it into 4 equal pieces. And the best way to do that is to cut directly in half down the fold line, which would now give us 2 22 by 36-inch pieces. That's now 2 half yards of fabric. And then cutting each of those in half would give us 18 by 22-inch rectangles. And you would now have 4 of them. That's 4 equal quarters. But instead of being a skinny 9-inch by 44 inches, it's a fat quarter of fabric. It's 18 by 22. Now the next 3 terms I'm just going to lump together as one. They kind of go together. If you thought about buying fabric for a quilt with many different fabrics in it, someone might suggest to you to get a jelly roll or a charm pack or a layer cake. And you might think, what in the heck is that? Now we're not talking about food, though that is the description of different cuts of fabric, usually in a full collection of fabrics. So a designer makes a fabric and then in different designs, and maybe the collection has 12 or 18 or 24 different designs in it with different colorways, and then you'd like to get a little bit of each of that. So they would sell you what would be called a jelly roll. Now that is here. It's the smallest unit of these measurements. It's strips that are the full 44-inch width of the fabric, but by 2.5-inch wide strips. This is really useful in sewing quilts because a lot of quilt patterns are designed around 2.5 inches as a starting unit. And when we get to the part about seam allowances, you'll understand why then you get 2-inch strips out of that with a finished quilt. But either way, you start with 2.5-inch wide strips. And they're usually 40, 42, 45 individual strips in there. And sometimes they're multiples of the same colors from a pack of a collection. And that would be a jelly roll. You can buy that relatively inexpensively, and you've got a little bit of every collection. Then you can graduate up to what's called a charm pack. And a charm pack is a 5-inch by 5-inch square. They're usually stacked up 40, 42, 45 of those individual pieces. Again, some of them multiples of the same exact fabric in a collection. And then this now gives you a selection of 5-inch squares, because now we're continuing the increments. Remember, a 2.5-inch strip, 2 of those together become a 5-inch piece, the 5-inch square. If you happen to hear any sound, it's because it is Florida in the afternoon and it's raining, and you can hear the rain on the tin roof that's above our building. I love having a metal roof here because when it's a rainy day, it just sounds great. And that last food related one that I told you about is called a layer cake. It's the one that gets me most excited, but it's actually not food either. It's 10-inch squares. And you'll notice this is a range of different red fabrics from a collection, and it's a layer cake. There's 40 to 42 fabrics in here, pieces of fabric, and some of them are the same. Again, it's from a collection, so they don't do 42 versions. You're not going to get 42 individual fabrics. You might get 2 or 3 of each particular pattern depending upon the way they put it together. These 10-inch squares now, of course, are twice the width of a 5x5 charm pack. So in fact, you could take a 10-inch square, cut it like this, and you would get 4 5x5-inch squares. So in fact, you see how you can step up with these different pieces. Now, of course, layer cakes being 42 or so 10-inch squares are going to be more expensive than a charm pack, which is only 42 5-inch squares. In fact, it's only a quarter of the fabric. Charm packs tend to work best for like lap quilts and quilts for babies or children. And then you can actually take a layer cake of an entire set and make a really good size adult lap blanket or add some good background fabrics. You can easily go. And in fact, if you look in the description below, I have a link to how to make a quilt top out of a charm pack. And it's probably the easiest quilt top you can start because you don't have to know a lot in advance. So the next idea I want to talk to you about is when a pattern calls for you to place the pattern piece on the fold. And you'll notice here on this pattern for a batwing face mask, we made a lot of them during the COVID-19 pandemic. It shows the fabric fold along the top. And so just ignore the other lines they happen to do because several of you can put multiple things on one piece of paper. The fabric fold. And what that means is you're not going to put this along a raw edge. You're actually going to put it on a folded edge of fabric because when we finish this, it's going to be mirrored. It'll look like a bat with wings, which is why it's called a bat wing template. And so you put that edge along the folded fabric and then don't cut this. You don't cut here, you cut all the other lines. So you place it on the fold. And I'll show you what that looks like right now. So I want to talk specifically here about seam allowances. And you may notice that there are some marks on my machine over here. So if you're sewing clothing, you might have a wider seam allowance. In other words, if I'm going to sew this, I might choose a very wide seam allowance here. But if I'm sewing for a quilt, I'm going to want the very skinny seam allowance. We use 1/4 inch seam allowances. Now, a 1/4 inch seam allowance is still part of just the seam allowance concept. That 1/4 inch is really easy to use in quilting because we're using lots of easy hole measurements to add. So if we do a 2.5 inch block and we have a 2.5 inch raw piece of material and we sew a 1/4 inch seam on either side, that 1/4 inch added to another 1/4 inch makes 1/2 inch. That 2.5 inch strip has shrunk from 2.5 inches to 2 inches because we've taken a 1/4 inch off either side. Now that's something we would do quite often in quilting, also because we don't have quite the same stresses on quilt seams as you might have on clothing seams, and you're not very often going to have to let out a seam allowance on a quilt. The other part is sometimes you have lighter fabrics and darker fabrics, and depending upon how you put these together, you might have to, you might see a bit of a seam underneath a particular fabric, and you don't want it to be a real wide seam that comes up underneath there. That brings me to the next term, which is called the scant 1/4 inch seam, or scant 1/4 inch. This is interesting, and I've seen this talked about more often in older videos. I'm not a huge fan of scant 1/4 inch seams, and it's because 1/4 inch is already pretty small, and a scant 1/4 inch is where you cheat even more inside of the 1/4 inch. It might be more likely known as like a 3/16 or a 5/32 seam, which is really hard for your brain to wrap around how big that is. It's sort of like instead of putting the needle right down through the middle of the 1/4 inch mark, you move it over a little bit. And I'm going to show you on the machine what that looks like. Now I'll tell you about a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that's when you would sew in even closer. So rather than putting the fabric right up against the edge, You would even cheat a little more to the inside. So as you sew, you're actually trying to come in a little bit. See how that fabric's not even quite touching. And you'll notice the difference. Look how much more I've come in on a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this is often told for projects where you have to have very specific measurements and you need a scant 1/4. I don't like it because this right here is such a small seam allowance that if it were to open it up at all later, you'd be in so much trouble. The next 2 terms have everything to do with pressing. And the first is called finger pressing. Now you're going to hear that quite a bit actually if you're doing some quilting with rather intricate designs and you're going to keep loading stuff up and not ironing as you go, or pressing as you go, I should say. I'm a huge fan of pressing as you go. In fact, I really love log cabin quilts, and they turn out the best if you press and trim every single time you sew a piece of fabric on. But if you're not going to do that, you would finger press as you go along. And I want to show you what that looks like as you're sewing. You would finger press just to get the items flat so you can now add another piece of fabric on as you're doing your piecing of quilts. This next one is called pressing to the dark. And you may hear this and not really understand what someone means when they say it. What it means is maybe you have 2 different colors of fabric together, a light and a dark. And as you sew them together, you now have to open that seam up. And the general rule of thumb in quilting is that you always want to press toward the dark, meaning you want the seam to go toward the dark fabric so that it's harder to see under the dark fabric from above. Because once you take like a light fabric and then put a batting underneath it, it starts to show everything between the batting and the fabric. So you're looking at the top of the fabric, you look through. If you have a dark piece of fabric that's been pushed toward the light, even though it's under a piece of the light, it's going to change that complexion and you'll start to see like a dark outline. Or you might get threads or something else that come off. So you always want to try to press toward the dark. Now what happens if you have 2 rather dark fabrics or 2 light fabrics? Well, you're kind of able to do what you need to do there and press it in the right way so that things are easier to sew together. And lastly, I love the name of this because it kind of goes with the food thing. There is something on your machine called the feed dogs. And the feed dogs are, it's a little confusing because they're called dogs, and why are they called dogs? And what are they? They're feed dogs? Are they dogs eating? No, really, it feeds the fabric through your machine. So let's go to the machine and I'll show you what a feed dog is. So feed dogs are the part of the machine. I'm going to take this presser foot off so you can see the feed dogs more accurately. So they'll make sense. So the feed dogs are right down in here. You see this part? Right down in here, and they're kind of sticky. They're serrated. Can you kind of hear that? And what happens is as the needle moves up and down, they move. So you notice they go up and they're going to impact the fabric and pull it as the needle goes down. And then as the needle comes back up, you see how they've dropped below the surface? Because it needs to not be moving fabric while the needle is down into the machine. So now it comes back up and it grabs the fabric and pushes it back the distance I'm doing for my measurement. Now as I change measurements on my, so now I'm going to change the measurement to a really long stitch. Now look how much farther they move. They go a lot forward and back. And as I change it down to a really low stitch, look, they barely move. They're barely moving backwards. That regulates the speed at which the fabric pushes through the machine. So as you go, the feed dogs push the fabric through faster with a longer stitch length or shorter with a shorter stitch length. Now, important to know that this is why you're supposed to let the machine take the fabric on its own and you're not supposed to push it. It's a really bad idea for you to be pushing. So that's what the feed dogs are. All right, those are 10, well, and a few more sewing terms that I think you should know. And the odds are that you knew some of these already. If you've spent any time sewing, you've heard of these before. But the truth is I spent 20 plus years thinking it was salvage, and who knows how long you've spent wondering what some of these things meant exactly. I'm glad you joined me this time on the video, and I hope that this is helping you to feel more confident when you watch videos showing you tutorials and can understand exactly what people are doing. Or when you're watching those videos on the new ideas of social media where everything's super fast and no one explains anything, well, you can get an idea why they're pushing something with their finger, or why they've ironed it a certain way, pressed it toward the dark. You can at least get an idea why they did that. All right, folks, until next time, I hope that you will take these to heart and maybe go find out what kind of jelly rolls and charm packs and layer cakes you can get a hold of. And until next time, stay crafty. Bye for now. Ooh, a layer cake. Now I have to stop at Publix on the way home. Hey, it's somebody's birthday somewhere.